think this is part 4 of week 4, which is going to be talking about vectors. So we just covered arrays in the last video, if you want to go watch that. But this video is all about vectors, and we're going to talk about vectors in C++, how to use them. We rarely use arrays just because they're kind of old school. They're not as good. Vectors are dynamic, and we're going to talk about them right now. So suppose we want to store test scores for a school. So right now I've got, I think, 11 people in my synchronous chat right now, and I want to score you guys on the tests we did this morning. I have no way of knowing how many students are going to register because maybe there's a deadline next month and I could get more students coming in, or more people could join the room right now. Either what I have to do is pick a size with my array that I'm not likely to exceed. So I know for some reason Georgian has a cap of 40 students in a class. So I could make my array 41. And then, I'll always have enough room to fit as many students because I know I'll never have more than that. Or what I could do is use a dynamic array, also known as a vector. If we do option 1, we're wasting memory, we're wasting space, and we're just guessing a size, and it could still be too small. You might think you will never have more than 100 students, and then, maybe one day something changes and you have an online class of a couple hundred, and then your array will break because everything will be out of bounds. So what we do is we use a dynamic array such as a vector. There's no memory wasted, and it can dynamically change depending on how many students we have. So basically, a vector is a container in the standard template library. So it's actually an object. So talking about object-oriented programming, we're referencing an object, and we can use methods in that object to access elements in the array and stuff. So it's a little bit different than an array. So I should say vector. An array, it's basically an array that can grow and shrink in size at execution time. So you don't have to stop your program. You can do it while you're running. And it provides similar semantics and syntax as arrays. They're very efficient. They do provide bounds checking. And there's a lot of cool functions like sort, reverse, find, and more that you don't have in an array. You just only have them in vectors. So the way we declare them is if we're using our namespace std, then you just type vector, and then the type of vector you want inside of the angle brackets, so a vector of characters or a vector of integers, and then the name. Now, very important to remember, we have to use this include, okay? You have to use the preprocessor directive of vector. If you don't include that, you won't have access to the vector library and any of the methods in it, okay? So because it's an object and we're using that object-oriented template class, we have to include the vector preprocessor directive. These are both empty vectors. There's no elements in them, okay? So we haven't initialized them. But don't worry, vectors are always initialized by default or automatically, so it won't fill it with garbage values. It'll just fill it with zeros. Here, we're using constructor initialization. So we're saying that this is going to be a vector of characters. We're naming it vowels, and there's going to be 5 characters in the vector, and we're not providing an initialization list. Here, we're creating an integer vector called test scores. There's 10 integers in the vector of test scores, and it automatically sets them to 0. We don't have to do that ourselves. We also need to import a library for ArrayList in Java, so it's the same. Perfect. Yeah, so it should be very similar to Java, very similar, you guys. So notice the single quotes, okay, for our vector of chars. We use single quotes, and in the third example here, the first argument is the number of arguments, okay, and then the second number is what we want to set all those values to. So notice here, there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're declaring or initializing your vector. Okay, curly braces. That's my best curly brace you're going to get to set the values, okay? And it will automatically know that the size is 5. Here, same thing for the integers. Here, we're using round brackets, okay? So with constructor initialization, the first value is going to be 365 elements. So, this is my best 365 elements, and they're all going to be set to 80. After the comma, that's what this is doing. 80, 80, 80. That's terrible drawing, but cut me some slack. Cool. Some things to keep in mind with vectors. So they're dynamic in size. All the elements have to be the same type. They're stored in memory. They can be accessed at their position or their index. Same thing with arrays. They start at 0, and then the last element is their size minus 1. So again, if it was 10, then you would be 0 to 9. There's no checking to see if you're out of bounds if you use square brackets, but there are, excuse me, many useful functions that we can use that do have bounds checking. So if you use the array syntax, which you can use to get something at a specific element, there won't be bounds checking. But if you use the .at method, then there is bounds checking. All elements are initialized to 0. They're very efficient, and we can use looping to get through them very often. So it's an object-oriented programming, or an OOP container, that's defined in the standard library. That's why we use the include preprocessor. It's just important to remember that. So accessing a vector, we can use something called array syntax, right? Which is the square brackets. And you can put your index that you want. So here we're getting index of 1. And you can use the array index. But if you use the array index, there is no bounds checking, okay? That's what you want to remember. If we go to vector syntax, okay, which I highly encourage you guys to use, we use the .at method and then round brackets with the index that you want to get at that. And there is bounds checking on this. So because it's an object in the standard library, there are methods that are predefined in that class or in that object that we can use. So .at is one of them, okay? Keep that in mind. You can change the context, the contents of the vector using the same .at method. So instead of just printing it out, we can use cin and then do .at and then the index, or we can just do .at the index and then equals, and we're assigning it a value. So exact same thing as arrays. When did they grow as needed? Okay, so you're probably thinking this is great. They're all the same thing as arrays. It's all the exact same syntax. There's a couple extra methods we can use. We use the .pushback element, okay, to make them grow. So this is the cool part. This is what's exciting. So .pushback and then the element that you want to add. So here we have an array of size 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 195 and 99. And then we use the .pushback method and we add 80 as our score, and it will get added to the end. So very important to note that 90 is going to get added after 80. So it just pushes it to the back of the array. So now it'll reallocate the required space, and we'll have 5 elements, okay? So it automatically takes care of allocating or deallocating the memory. You don't have to worry about that. That's the magic part of vectors. So if you are out of bounds, remember arrays don't have bounds checking, and many vectors provide bounds checking if you use the right methods. So an exception and an error message will be generated. So you'll see here, I have a vector with 2 elements, 195, and I'm trying to get the .at, okay, so I'm using that method at the index of 5, which doesn't exist, okay? So what's going to happen is it'll give you this termination error, and it'll throw, you can kind of see the bolded points of the error message are what's important. Out of range, vector range check, which is 5, but it's actually a size of 2. All right. So kind of can look confusing, but it'll print this in the console. So it's saying you're trying to access 5, but you only actually have 2 elements. It'll throw an exception and tell you how to fix it. And it may look different depending on the compiler you're using, but while we do have exception handling during testing, to make sure our program doesn't crash, we want to make sure during production that we will use exception handling. So we'll cover that later, but right now this is just how you throw that out of bounds exception error. Okay, let's go to CodeLight, download the week 4 vectors, and we'll just see some real world examples of how to use vectors. Cool. So get that week 4 vectors main.cpp open. I've got mine here, 4 vectors. We'll just go through it. Get my active project and start uncommenting some of this code. Oops. So we can see here these first 3 declarations. I'm making a vector. Actually, I'll give you guys a sec. You can pause the video here if you're getting it open still. Give me a thumbs up if you guys are ready to go with vectors, with this file. Crash meet boogers. Ready? Cool. Anyone need a minute, or are you guys good? Throw a thumbs down if you still need a minute. I'll give you guys a little bit of time. are good to go. Cool. Awesome. You guys are great. Sticking with me. So remember, we need to use the include vector preprocessor directive. Okay. So there you go. If you don't have this, none of this stuff will work, and these won't be highlighted. So if I do Control S, this is a keyword, and it should be yellow. I don't know, whatever color you're using, but it'll be a highlighted keyword. So here I'm declaring a vector of type char, or characters. It's called vowels, and it's going to be empty. Now, there's a couple other ways we can initialize it. We can initialize it to have 5 characters long. We can give it the constructor initialization, and they'll each be initialized to empty or 0. And then remember, when you're using the array list subscript notation, there will be no bounds checking. So let's just uncomment this line and run it. We're basically setting, we'll uncomment these two as well. Same example as what we did with arrays. We're setting, well, actually, I'll comment this line out too. We're setting a vector here. So line 13, 15, and 16, you can uncomment. We're setting a vector to have the values A, E, I, O, and U of type char, and then we're going to print out the element 0 and the element 4, which is the first and the last. So it should be A and U. If I run this, that's what we see, A and U, right? Perfect. Cool. So moving down, I'll recomment these so that they're not in the way. But here we're going to have 2 examples or 2 variations for constructing vector objects. So here we can see, if I comment these out, we're creating a vector of type ints, so it's holding integers, and they're all called test scores. This one's going to have 3 elements that are all initialized to 0. This one will have 3 elements that are all initialized to 100. And this one, I'm just initializing the values, and it's going to automatically know that it's 3 because of the amount of elements I gave it. And they're going to have 198 and 89. So I'll comment out the first 2 because these ones have all different values. And then these ones, I'm going to print them out using the array syntax first, which is with the square bracket notation. And then later on, we'll print them out using the vector syntax. So I'll save that and run it, and we should see 198 and 89 printed out. Test scores using array syntax 198 and 89, as you can see there. Cool. So coming down a little bit further, if we uncomment these lines, now we're going to use vector syntax, which is using the .at method. So we're going to print .at 0, .at 1, and .at 2. Then what we can use is also a method called .size. This is a very useful method to use, especially in loops. If you want to loop through an array list, sorry, not an array list, and a vector, if you want to loop through it, you use the .size method, because then it will loop through the actual size of elements in that array, that vector. I keep confusing what I'm calling it. So .length for Java, .size for C++, if that helps you remember them, then there you go. They're very similar, but you could loop through if you had a vector of 1,000 elements, you could just use .size instead of hard coding the 1,000 value. Yeah, whatever helps you, honestly. So I'll save this and run it, and we can see it'll print out the exact same things, 198 and 89. We're just using vector syntax here versus array syntax. And now we're going to actually input some information into the vector using our array our vector syntax. So we're going to update our test scores, and then we're going to redisplay them. So I'm commenting out lines 44 to 47. So basically, we're using cin and then the test scores.at 0, 1, and 2 to change those elements at that index using the cin on our keyboard to update the test scores and then print them back out with updated test scores. So I'll save that and run it. We'll zoom in so you guys can see what this looks like. But basically, we printed it out using array syntax, vector syntax. We already did that. There are 3 scores. Whoa, what happened to my voice there? There are 3 scores in the vector. Okay, so that's the that's the vector.size method. So it's printing out 3. If we deleted one or if we added one, it'll automatically update that number. So updated test scores, let's do 10, 20, 30. And the updated test scores are 10, 20, and 30. Go. Now, coming down a little bit further, entering a test score to add to the vectors. So this is where we're going to actually use the pushback method for the first time, where we'll dynamically change the vector size. So uncommenting some of these lines, I'm declaring an int variable here using C++ 11 list initialization, okay? And I'm setting it to 0. And then what we're going to do is get information from the keyboard and store it in that variable. Then we're going to use the test scores.pushback. So this is my my vector name, test underscore scores. I'm using .pushback, and then I'm passing it the variable of whatever I set on my keyboard. Then what we're going to do is ask for one more variable or one more test score to be entered. We're going to reuse the score to add variable and get a number from our keyboard, and then we're going to use the .pushback method again to our vector and pass that variable, which is going to be the second value that the user enters. Then I'm just reprinting out my test scores, and I know that I added 2, so I hard-coded to print at 3 and 4, and then I'm printing the vector size, so this should say 5. There's now 5 scores in the vector. Instead of reprinting out or hard coding, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code, I could use a loop to go through it dynamically, because what happens if the user only enters 1 and then say this was accidentally commented out and I only had 4 elements, it's going to come here and it's going to say, you're out of bounds. So using a loop is a little bit safer, because then we can loop through the actual size that it is, right? So let's save that and run it and see if our pushback method works. So there's updated test scores 10, 20, 30. So our updated test scores are now 10, 20, and 30. Okay. And now it's saying enter a test score to add to the vector. So I'm going to add 40. Enter one more test score to add to the vector. I'm going to add 50. And now look, updated test scores 10, 20, 30. And here's our dynamic size in the vector, 40 and 50. And then look, there's 5 scores in the vector. So that 3 changed to a 5 using the .size method from the vector library. Cool. Now we're going to try to show you guys an error or an exception because we're using the .at syntax or the vector syntax, not the array syntax. Because if you use the array syntax, right, if I didn't use the .at method here, but I just used the square brackets, then I wouldn't get anything. But this should cause an exception, and then I do test scores .at and then the 10th index. Now, when I tested this on my machine, the program crashed and then I wasn't able to see the error message, but you guys let me know. It might be a little bit different for you depending on your machine. So we'll just go through this program, updated test scores 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50, and then look. Oh, it crashed. I saw the error there for a second. Program exited, but unfortunately, wasn't able to show you guys. And I wasn't able to figure out why exactly this happened. It just leaves 10, 20, and 30. I want to know for you guys if it actually stays on your screen. So you'll notice it'll stay on my screen for a second down here. You'll see that error, but then it just exits the program, unfortunately. There. So unfortunately, but then it doesn't show it in my build output. So I wasn't able to figure that out, unfortunately. Yeah, it just says zero errors and 0 warnings. Let me know what you guys got for that. Were you guys able to see the error output in the crash, or did it just exit the program before you could see the error? Any luck with that, guys? Just curious about your machines. I could try waiting for a copy this line of code and try waiting for some keyboard input so it might pause the program. But for some reason, my program, when it hits that error, it just exits out of it. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And we can see here, yeah, the out of range exception. Did anybody have the same thing happen to them? Just curious. I'm not getting anything in my chat, by the way, so I don't know if you guys are saying anything, but nothing? Are you guys, did you guys get it working? It crashed. Okay, so were you able to read the error or no? No. Okay, interesting. Um, let's see if I open this up, containing folder. I'm just a little bit curious because it's a good thing to be able to see that error, but if I open this up in Visual Studio Ultimate 2013, your screen froze. Okay, interesting. Oh, so if your screen froze, were you able to read it in your C++ or no? Okay. Um, so I've copied this all and then run this from Visual Studio to process, find the min.gw compiler. I wonder if we just run exe file debug instead of there. Oh, it still crashed. Yeah. Oh well. You can see it for a second, so hopefully that's good enough to be able to help you. But okay, moving on. Anyways, so we'll get rid of that. I'll try to come up with an answer for that for next week. But let's make an example of a 2D vector. So a vector of vectors here, right? So we can uncomment this line, and this should look pretty familiar. Vector, and then it's a vector of vectors, right? So the type is a vector of type int. So that's how you do it. It's a double greater than less than sign with int and then the vector type and then your vector name. Then you can use your open braces and style it like this so that you can visualize the rows and the columns, right? So this is going to be 3 rows with 4 columns going down. And we're calling it movie ratings, right? So we've got reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3, movie 1, movie 2, movie 3, movie 4. Now, we can access them with array syntax. I'm going to just comment out this exception because I don't want it to, I'll actually comment all these lines out so that they're firing every time. Those out, comment those out. You guys can keep them commented if you want, but I'm just going to minimize my program so that I don't have to go through that every time. Sorry, 1 second, guys. All right, so we've got our 2D vector declaration, and then we've got array syntax using square brackets at index 0 and 0, which would be this one, 0 and 1, which should still be the 0 row, but the 1 index, 0, 2, and 0, 3. So that's going to be everything for reviewer number 1. All right, so let's run that. And here we can see here are the movie ratings for reviewer 1 using array syntax 1, 2, 3, 4, which is what we expect to see. Right? Now, commenting out the next lines, here's the movie ratings for reviewer number 2 using vector syntax. So here you use .at, you pass it the row. Okay, so the row this is row 0, this is row 1. Right? So we want to get row 1, we have to pass it 1, and then we want to get the element 0, 1, 2, and 3. So we should expect to see 1, 2, 4, and 4. So you do .at 1, .at 0, .at 1, .at 1. And this will provide us with bounds checking using the .at method. So this is better. I just wanted to show you can do it with array syntax, but this is better. Okay, so rerunning this program. There we go. And here, like we expected, I wanted 1, 2, 4, and 4. So for reviewer 2, we have 1, 2, 4, and 4. Here's what we expected. Awesome. I wonder if I return 1. So that's how you do a 2D vector. 1, and I just have an idea here to throw the error from before. This should cause an exception. Okay. Anyways, I was just wondering if I returned 1, if it would return the error to me and not exit. But we'll save that, and I will get you guys a description of your assignment. I'll end the video here because this is about vectors, and then I'll have the assignment description in a separate video for you guys. So I'll stop this recording.